Hi everyone, I am Professor Adrien Rannaud from the University of Toronto, and in this talk I will present a brief part of a forthcoming book I wrote on the history and politics of one of the most important magazines in Quebec, La Revue Moderne. My approach to this long-running magazine is shaped by the dynamic field of press and literature studies. This is an interdisciplinary branch that argues that periodicals can be read through the critical frameworks and method offered by literary studies. Since the beginning of the 21st century, scholars in the Francophone area have immensely improved our understanding of the process in which literary discourses and practices in France, Belgium, or Quebec were constituted and circulated thanks to the press. As a part of this burgeoning field of literary and cultural studies that delves into the genealogy of mediatic culture, I closely examined a large amount of columns in order to outline what I call a historical poetics of magazine. In my forthcoming book, temporally entitled La Révolution du magazine au Québec, I address several questions. For example, what is a chronicle in the magazine? And a reportage? How do we write an interview and an editorial? Which type of fiction can we find in this periodical? How do these several mediatic genres and literary practices deal with seriality and monthly periodicity? What does time mean in the context of magazine publishing? What does it reveal about the complex relationship between text and images, journalists, writers, and audience? And finally, how has La Revue Moderne exerted a crucial influence on the literary and public spheres? Today, I examine how La Revue Moderne shaped modernity during the 30s. My work is inspired by Ferhamol and Michel Smith's book, Magazines, Travel and Middlebrough Culture, but also by Yvan Lamonde's essay, La modernité au Québec, 1929-1939. Lamonde points out that modernity is a key word to understand Quebecois public field and mediatic culture during the Great Depression. He writes in the beginning of his book that, I quote and translate, Quebec faces a choice, joining or refusing modernity during the 30s. Indeed, it must be said that this time period constitutes a combination of social, mediatic, and cultural changes, which in turn participated to the emergence of a field of mass production and of new ways of consuming and appreciating cultural practices and discourse. Notably, the development of new technologies and mediatic forms accelerated information circulation. It also reconfigured offer and access to entertainment, especially to women's audience, which was growing since the turn of the century. In the meantime, we can observe the rising of a middlebrow culture, defined by central ideas such as self-improvement, compromise, and sophistication, but also by a strong relationship with the Quebecois identity. As Ferhamol and Michel Smith say in their book, I quote, "In a Canadian context, Middlebrow takes on a particular resonance through its entanglement with cultural nationalism and with the debates over modernism and cosmopolitanism in the middle decades of the 20th century." Unquote. Then the economic crisis leads to a reinforcement of conservative ideologies based on the regeneration of Catholic and nationalist prescription in French Canadian area, and especially in the province of Quebec. In that perspective, the influx of American cultural products and imaginaries and the significance of modernism represents a threat that must be taught. In my presentation, I argue that La Revue Moderne attempted to shape a complex modernity during the 30s by circulating new ideas on consumerism and what we call middlebrow culture, but also by criticizing social progress and renewing traditional ideologies. We could say the same thing about other similar periodicals such as La Revue Populaire. Nevertheless, La Rue Moderne appears to be both significant and unique in its negotiation of a moderate place in the Quebecois mediatic field in the 30s, as we will see first. Then, I will focus on two series of texts and images. First, I will study the construction of La Maison Moderne, a project from 1936 in which the magazine tried to encourage economic recovery. The second part of my presentation will focus on the Courrier du Mois column running from 1929 to 1938 and authored by Marjolaine. La Revue Moderne was launched in 1919 by one of the first and most famous female journalists, Madeleine. At this time, she edited the women's page, Le Royaume des Femmes, for the daily newspaper La Patrie. Following the end of World War I, Madeleine left La Patrie and proclaimed that she wanted to support and promote French-Canadian intellectual, literary, and artistic life. La Revue Moderne was created to achieve this goal, and Madeleine, in the first issue, claims the necessity of a periodical which could play both a channeling role between the Québécois intelligentsia and the audience, and represent a metaphoric salon for women's audience. In the editorial entitled Unite to Grow, she invites readers to welcome La Revue Moderne as an instrument for national peace and cultural awakening. La Revue Moderne will successfully confirm the value of our poets and prose writers. It has to replace the extravagant magazines in our homes, which teach bad taste and distort our women's and girls' mentality. Unquote. Later in the same issue, Madeleine introduces women's page Femina as follows, I quote, "For several years, I have been dreaming of a small and intimate salon where I would offer the opportunity to share our ideas, our desires, our ambitions, our dreams too. Today I give you this place made of intimacy and trust. I'm sure you will join me, comprehensive and sincere as you are, to spend recreation and relaxation time together." Unquote. Madeleine followed the example of Parisian magazines like La Vie Heureuse and Femina. However, after a few controversies during which the periodical played its role of intellectual magazine, La Revue Moderne became more like a women's magazine in the 20s. More especially, fashion coverage, travel articles, and advertising intentionally addressed to a middle-class female audience, and Madeleine addressed her editorials to a female readership. After several turbulences within the editorial board, resulting in Madeleine's definitive departure from the magazine, the historian and intellectual Jean Bruchesi took over the management of La Revue Moderne. We are in 1930. Bruchesi was more assertive than Madeleine. He denounced both American journalistic production and the collective disinterest of French-Canadian intellectuals in a local periodical. Literature is at the heart of his preoccupations, but because of the Depression, it is above all the national effort that was encouraged by the young editor-in-chief. He writes in 1930, "We have many causes to support, many causes to defend, the cause of art, the cause of literature, the cause of our economic expansion, and the cause of solidarity, which is more essential than ever if we want French Canadians to survive." Bruchesi based his leadership on the principle of this survival, and he militated in favor of Francisation, that is, the maintenance and expansion of a French culture and language in North America. Bruchesi left the magazine at the end of 1935. Under his direction and that of the subsequent teams, the 1930s Revue Moderne tended to become an instrument of Francisation, as Bruchesi said. However, this project couldn't combat the influence of American magazines that swarmed over French-speaking Canada and established the rules of a hegemonic and commercial media. While half of the articles, posts, and columns were written by a proudly nationalist French-Canadian editorial team, the other half, mainly addressed to women, were taken from North American periodicals. It includes the American The Delineator, where La Rue Moderne picked up Celia Caroline Scholl's column, and several articles on decoration, cooking, and fashion. For the time period, some scholars talk of two magazines in one that is intellectual and politically committed, and one that is oriented toward female consumers. It is also, as Fairmont and Michel Smith show in their book, and I agree with them, a typically middle-brow ethos during the 30s. At the center of this ethos, a certain idea of modernity was being played out in the magazine. The title of the periodical already reflects this editorial and ideological imperative. What does modernity mean in Quebec? And how could a magazine be a national modernity flagship? This is what we will see through the two following examples. In the September 1936 issue, La Rue Moderne announces the construction of La Maison Moderne. This new type of housing unit echoes to several similar initiatives in Canada, England, and America. It is also a concrete response to the government's new housing policy set up by the Prime Minister of Canada in 1935, Richard B. Bennett. The Dominion Housing Act was passed to finance the construction of nearly 5,000 units on the basis of loans totaling $20 million. The Canadian government then tried to guarantee access to housing for the middle classes, and in that way to revitalize national economy. In addition to that, and in order to promote its new policy, the government organized a competition among architects. The intense attention to the Dominion Housing Act distinguishes La Revue Moderne from other French-Canadian periodicals. In 1936, the magazine includes several articles enthusiastically discussing the federal policy. In the meantime, the new administrator, Louis H. Duclos, hires the architect Henri Sicotte Labelle to imagine what could be the perfect house in Quebec. Labelle provides two plans with two different styles: the ultra-modern house and the modernized classic house. A referendum allows readers to choose their preferred style. Unsurprisingly, the modernized classic house won the vote, and the construction began in the summer of 1936. During this time, La Rue Moderne generated public interest by publishing pictures of the construction site and by organizing an architecture competition for children. In September 1936, the magazine publishes a commemorative issue in which there is a photograph of the house, information on the public ceremony for the opening, and a remarkable number of advertisements for all the companies that contributed to the success of the project. The house is located in the very chic, upper-class Outremont district of Montreal. However, La Rue Moderne focuses on the middle class's purchasing power and invents a narrative in which modernity, nationalism, and Middleborough culture are intertwined. First of all, the promotion of La Maison Moderne is part of a fundamentally advertising discourse in which the figure of the reader plays a decisive role. The magazine's director, Duclos, frequently makes subscribers witnesses and actors in the construction of the house. I quote, "With the promise of once again pleasing its distinguished readers, La Revue Moderne is carrying out another initiative this month by presenting a section of La Maison Moderne." Unquote. We can recognize the deployment of a semantics of sophistication that also tends to confer an exceptionality to the readers, especially women's audience. As it is written on the cover, the commemorative issue is, I quote, "dedicated to the gracious Canadian housewife." In addition, La Rue Moderne sells suburbia and the suburban Middleborough dream through different forms of storytelling. Each column, each post emphasizes the central ideas of the suburbs, such as the combination of simplicity and comfort, the appeal of a green environment located only a few steps from downtown Montreal, and the centrality of the housewife within this new 20th century utopia. But there is a fundamental principle that gives full meaning to the construction in Outremont and its story in La Revue Moderne: modernity. As we can see in the 6 months of La Maison Moderne adventure, modernity serves as a narrative framework. However, modernity does not have fixed meaning within the magazine. On the one hand, it refers to the positive idea of progress. On the other hand, it is associated with an artistic excess that does not benefit French Canada. When he presents the two plans of La Maison Moderne, The magazine director, Duclos, is cautious, even critical of what he calls, I quote, the unpleasant excess of outrageous modernism, unquote. We can see that La Rue Moderne seeks to strike a balance between the innovative and the traditional, or to put it in the word of the magazine itself, between the modernized and the classical. The attraction for modernity has its roots in suburban advertising, but also in a social discourse with a nationalist content. In that case, modernity may stand for a democratic and good value concept. In June 1936, the director of l'École du Meuble de Montréal, Jean-Marie Gauvreau, gives an interview in which he praises the project. For him, La Maison Moderne will encourage French Canadians to buy furniture made with local wood and will serve what he calls a good Canadianism. In short, acceptable modernity is the precondition for the reactivation of a community of a Canadian us that finds its meaning in the process of economic recovery. So let's move on to another aspect of modernity in La Revue Moderne. We leave the cover and the very first page of the magazine to dive into the last page of the periodical. Indeed, since its launch in 1919, the magazine has been home to a very popular column which was held by the director herself during the 20s. From 1919 to 1929, Madeleine was in charge of the Courrier column. She answered letters from several readers on subjects as diverse as literature, politics, beauty tips, human relationships, etc. In 1929, it was another female author who took charge of the Courrier du Mois column, Marjolaine. At the turn of the decade, Marjolaine also appears to be a popular journalist in Quebec. Following the departure of Madeleine from the newspaper La Patrie in 1919, she started editing the women's page, Le Royaume des Femmes, until 1925. In the meantime, she was known for her children's stories. In a text in which Madeleine pays homage to her colleague, it says that, I quote, Marjolaine always lived in almost absolute solitude. She was not acquainted with society and mundanity, which gave her more time for work, reading, and study. Unquote. And I think this judgment gives us a good overview of Marjolaine's stern style. You can see it in the Courrier du Mois column between 1929 and 1938. In common with Madeleine's ethos, it simulates the same bond of friendship between the colonist and her readers. But the Salon looks more like a confessional, where everything written is seen through Marjolaine's Catholic faith. She frequently invites her readers to be inspired by the model of Santa Monica, who is the patron saint of Christian mothers. Moreover, she considers her correspondent's misfortunes as what she calls, I quote her, trials of the good Lord that require trust in the divine force, unquote. This is a huge change in the Courrier du Mois. If Madeleine was at the same time severe and funny, playful and benevolent with her pen pals, the town with Marjolaine is getting more serious. We can also say the same thing about modernity in her answers. As Madeleine used to promote modernism in literature and art, Marjolaine, on her part, stood as a herald of anti-modernism. This ideological change is correlated to the action of the director Jean Bruchesi, and opposing the valorization of modernity which ran through the whole collections in the 30s. Reading tips are indicative of this position. Marjolaine declares war to what she calls the modern genre. I quote, to write beautiful and good things, to make people love life so precious, to help them become better people, to sow goodness, confidence, courage, love, is to fight against the odious modern propaganda that likes to spread all the evils of humanity, to point out all its defects, to say the least, to bring all the scandals to light, and to arouse evil by flattering the patients. What a pity. Unquote. From this point of view, any element raised by the correspondence lends to criticism of modernity. Marjolaine values the family and the idea of a Quebec society based on respect for traditions. For her, modernity is the cause of disintegration of the family model. In that order, the Courrier du Mois column becomes the place for women's social prescription. In 1934, she writes, I quote, "You have seen how modern influence distort minds and create an unfortunate mentality. When mothers are subjected to it and abandon themselves to it, it is the foundation of the home that crumbles. It is the sweet intimacy of the family that agonized." Unquote. Such a discursive and ideological refocusing tends to remove other subjects that were traditionally at the heart of Madeleine's letter in the 20s. On the one hand, practical advice is diminished during the 30s. Literary mentoring, although alive and well, is also less present than it was under the magazine's founder. Far from encouraging women's literary careers, Marjolaine suggests, on the contrary, that her correspondents should consider writing as a distraction that cannot steal them from other duties. On the other hand, Marjolaine writes a lot to her correspondents about the beauty of the time passing and the return of the seasons. This cyclical representation of time is not isolated. It can be found among the female authors of this time period, including Marjolaine herself, and particularly in collections of short texts that are published in Quebec. In the case of the Courrier du Mois column, the representation of time passing and the season that return from year to year reflects an appreciation of the permanence of things, as well as the use of the modern media magazine in service of a traditional vision of French Canada society. La Maison Moderne and Marjolaine's answer to readership are part of a very large stream of thought which shows the ambivalence of modernity in Quebec, and especially in a new and popular media such as the magazine. Similar to other periodicals like La Revue Populaire, Le Samedi, Radio Monde in Quebec, for example, and to several examples in Canada and the United States, La Revue Moderne emerged as a nationalist magazine at the beginning of the 20th century. The patriot ethos did not dissolve with the periodical specialization in the female readership. On the contrary, middlebrow culture, which appears to be more feminine than lowbrow and highbrow in Quebec during the 30s, reactivates the dual paradigm of acceptable modernity and nationhood in the magazine's page. At the end of the 30s, this double paradigm, which still affects the magazine's space of information and consumption, also presides over the publication of fiction. Indeed, a large proportion of the short stories written at the turn of the 40s revealed the aspiration and concerns of Quebec's middlebrow culture. The triad of modernity, nationalism, and consumerism found a new place of expression in the fiction that was to make the success of many writers at this time, helping to establish the legitimacy and the popularity of La Revue Moderne in the literary field and in the mediatic culture in Quebec. Thank you, and I look forward to hearing your comments and questions.